Thank you everyone for being here today. It's great to have this kind of turnout to see someone that's give us a very special presentation. John is a photographer of how many decades? I don't even hesitate.
52 years.
52 years. And long-time member of the society and former board member, recruited me to the board as a matter of fact. And so John has an illustrious history with the Historical Society, and you can tell he's quite a collector from what you see on the tables out here. With that, I want to turn the program over to John because I think he needs no further introduction.
All of you for coming today. It's always good to see a good crowd when you put an effort into something, and this is helpful to the society, certainly. Today we're going to be talking about the mechanics of the history of photography, and at the end we'll say a few more words about what photography represents more than just the mechanics of it. Well, as you heard, it's titled The History of Photography, and over here we have a box camera, we've got a tripod, and today I brought mainly just cameras. There's an old-time flash bulb there, a few rolls of film, but there was a lot more accessories that you needed. You needed tripods, you needed the film holders, and there's a couple of those over there. The old cameras had a slot in the back where you could put the film holder in. So when you were a photographer early on and you used this kind of plate, but even later, like up into probably the 50s, if you went to a high school basketball game, chances are you were carrying a bag full of these and a bag full of flash bulbs. And as Mr. Cruz pointed out earlier, the flash bulbs were very big and they were only good for one shot. So you put one in, you took a picture, and you threw the bulb away. First, we're going to start off with some questions. What did the first camera look like? Has anybody thought about that? What year was the first real photo taken? In what country was the photographic process developed? When were the first photos taken in America? During what war were over 7,000 photos made? Who was George Eastman? Who was Dr. Edwin Land? What year was the first digital camera introduced? And what modern devices have almost made the family camera obsolete? Probably everybody here knows that answer. This is what the first camera looked like. It was called the camera obscura, from the Latin dark chamber or dark room. There's an example of one over there by the window. I used it earlier to make a tracing of the president, Mr. Cruz, and at the end of the program we're going to cut it out with scissors, and we're going to end up with a silhouette portrait. Now, the camera obscura was used for several hundred years by artists. They would have a room and they'd have a pinhole in maybe a piece of tin or something that was opaque, and when the sun was shining especially, the image outside would be projected onto the opposite wall. They could then go up to it and trace the image. This was used by, thank you Lois, I was thinking I had a little ringing there, and adjust it as necessary. They had to trace that image, and of course you see that it's upside down. And it was good from two standpoints. Someone who wasn't a trained artist could take a scene and copy it on paper with true perspective and size. But a lot of fine artists, or people who have been trained as artists, look down on anybody who used this because they called it cheating. As you can see, that was kind of cumbersome. You could probably, with a couple men, you could spin that room on those skids, and you could maybe aim it in a different direction. But basically, your camera was always looking at the same thing, some kind of a scene out in the distance. Then they scaled that down, and they made a camera tent where they would go into a tent, sit on a chair, and they had a pinhole in one side, and they project the image. So that made it portable. And then finally, they went to the camera obscura portable, like I've got over there. It uses a portrait lens. It has a mirror at a 45 inside. We'll get to that next. And it has a glass on top where you put a piece of tissue paper and the image comes through and you trace it, and then you cut it out with scissors. I did the tracing of Mr. Cruz in about 45 seconds. So you just say, look sideways, hold perfectly still, and you quickly trace from the chin around the face. Then if they move a little bit, it doesn't matter. The back of the head isn't that important. This is actually the first photograph, or the first lasting photograph. It's an exposure of a scene across the street from a camera obscura. It took 8 hours to make that exposure, and that was in 1826. So when I say the first photograph, I don't mean that exactly. There were photographs before that time, but this is the first lasting photograph. There were a lot of people working in the early 1800s specifically. See, they had the camera obscura, and they had this image projected on the wall, but then they got lazy. They didn't really feel like standing there all day and tracing that image. They wanted to be able to do it automatically like we do now. So they experimented with chemistry and different materials and put that on the wall and made an image, or tried to make an image. Well, some of them succeeded in getting an image, but within days or even less time, it would fade. So that was the secret to getting a photograph that was worth anything, that it wouldn't fade when light hit it later. But, as I said, this is the first one that actually lasted. And this was made by Joseph Nicephore Niepce in 1826 in France. He and Louis Daguerre worked together. And then Joseph passed away, and Daguerre kept on working. This is a shot that Daguerre made, and it's interesting because it's the first image that showed people. There, can you see that? There's a man standing there having his shoe shine, and he stood still for 5 minutes, so he showed up. The rest of that French street scene had carts and horses going up and down and people walking, but they didn't show up because they were never in the spot very long. Now, I just read the other day that people have studied this very carefully, and they think there might be a couple more people. I think maybe I saw one right there, and I thought there might be one back here on this porch, but that doesn't matter too much. The fact is, there's one that shows up readily. So Daguerre was getting a pretty good process. As you can see, this was 1838, I think it was, and he had figured out a way to save it, to fix it. Now, the Daguerre process was something else. They start out with a copper plate. And generally, photographs in those days were fairly small because the lenses, if you wanted to make it faster, and that's how he got the 5-minute exposure, he had a lens instead of a pinhole. Pinholes are notoriously slow because they don't let much light through. But they're small pictures generally, and you take your copper plate and you plate it with silver. Then you expose it to several different chemicals in the dark, and it becomes light sensitive. Then you put it in your camera, you expose it, then you had to bring it out again in the dark, and you had to process the image with mercury, one of the things, and mercury was dangerous to work with. But the important thing here is that you were making an image directly on a piece of copper and one at a time. So photography was very expensive. You couldn't make like 12 images. You couldn't tell the photographer, I want 12 Wallace. You had to sit down and take a picture 12 times if you wanted 12 images. And that involved 5-minute exposures. That's a diagram of what the camera obscura looks like. As I said, there's a mirror and there's a plate of glass with a piece of paper taped on top of it. In 1837, Louis Daguerre invents his process that produced positive images on a silver copper plate, calls it the daguerreotype. And this was in France. And he was a pretty smart guy. There were a lot of people working toward that furiously, trying to get a photo. They knew they'd be rich and famous if they developed that. By 1839, he had the process sufficiently complete that he felt he could sell his rights to it. And he went to the French Academy of Science, the French government, and said, I'll sell you my process for a lifetime pension. Now think of that. He was going to be guaranteed a pension for life, and he wouldn't have to worry about any patent infringements or anything. He was a free man. He could just go on and do whatever he wanted. And he'd have money besides. So they loved it. When the Academy met and they looked at his process, there were people extending out the door into the streets. It was such an exciting time. Now, even though he was able to present pictures and the process and give it away, it wasn't finished. And he knew that. So he kept on working for years, and every time he would come up with another improvement, he would turn that over to the government. Needless to say, the process was taken by everybody. Everybody wanted to be a photographer. So they used it, and the government gave it away to them. And it was still a crude process involving wet plates, long exposures. You had to put people's head in a clamp to hold it still so they wouldn't move. And it came to America very quickly. And as you can see, some photographers were advertising a portrait from 50 cents to $10. (1855 to 1857), direct positive images on glass. That was ambrotypes and metal tintypes or ferrotypes were becoming popular in the United States. Now, this is still a few years before the Civil War. In 1865, Civil War. President Lincoln commissions Matthew Brady to produce photographs of the Civil War. And Matthew Brady hired a big fleet of photographers. Brady and many assistants produced 7,000 images. However, since the photos were made on glass plates and exposures were long, most of the images were still photos or posed photos with everyone very still. So when you see Civil War images, it might be Lincoln standing in front of a tent with two of his generals standing beside him, but they were all standing there like this. And if you saw a battle scene, it was where there were dead bodies and dead horses all across the field, but nobody was moving. So in order to capture the action of battle, you had to have an artist in the field. You're going to see a picture of one after a while. He was sitting there sketching the battle and sketching in the action that he was seeing. but most of the photos, and I've got one on my slideshow, you're going to see some horses coming across the river, and I kind of wondered about that. I assumed that was probably staged and the horses were standing still. This is a photographer's wagon that would have been typical in the Civil War. Matthew Brady sent out a lot of them. They had a dark room inside, and then worked out in the field. Of course, they were dodging bullets, so it was kind of a hazardous duty, but they were pretty driven. They were making money, and everything was working. The still image of Lincoln down near the cannons. Now, this is a colorized photo, and it doesn't show up very well. That was an old image, but somebody put some color to it. And here's the artist at work I mentioned. He's got a tablet and a pencil, and he's sitting there on high ground, viewing a battle and sketching it so he'd have some images in motion. This is a hospital scene, I think, where there were men laying around. And again, a camp with the cannon and limber. Photographer's wagon up here again. Here's a whole lot of dead bodies. Lincoln, I believe, and two of his generals. Here's a drummer boy. And again, a bunch of officers in front of a tent. A mortar entrenchment. Probably a little rest time before they made another charge. This is Fredericksburg, taken under fire. And a soldier who posed for a picture to be sent home, probably to his family. The era, I just need a little bit of spacers under here. I've got it all the way down. Two table knives would probably do it. Traveling throughout the mountains and plains, they carried their darkroom tents, glass plates, and chemicals on a pack mule. This is the era of westward expansion, and they wanted to see what was out there, publish it in magazines and the newspapers. Once a mule stumbled, and the photographer lost a month's work because the glass plates that he had exposed were all broken. So he had to go back to the scenes where he had shot the pictures and reshoot them. Using glass plate negatives meant setting up your tent, coating the glass with your emulsion in the dark, putting it in the film holders, exposing the images, and then processing the plates within minutes while the emulsion was still wet. Now let me pull this out. If you hold that. That was one of the hard things, was working with wet emulsion plates, and the fact that you had such little time to work with them. If they dried out, they wouldn't process properly. Of course, if it was cold outside, then they probably would last a little bit longer before you had to process them. 1870 is considered to be the center of the period in which the U.S. Congress sent photographers out to photograph the West. The most famous images then were taken by William Jackson and Tim O'Sullivan. Now this is a neat experiment. You've probably all seen a picture of this somewhere at some time. 1877, Edward Muybridge was given the job to photograph a horse. The owner of the horse had a big bet on this. He said that a horse's all four legs left the ground when he was at a gallop, and the other man said no. So my bridge set up 12 cameras with tripwires. So each of these frames was taken when the horse tripped a wire, and that camera went off. And as you can see right here, it's very obvious, and here, that the horse's legs are all off the ground. Here you can see it's on the ground, and of course on the rest of it, one leg is always on the ground. So this was probably the first time that photography was used for evidence, if you will, something that people couldn't just see with their naked eye. In 1888, George Eastman of Rochester, New York, invented photographic film to replace the boxes of plates and toxic chemicals. The film might have been a sheet of film, but it was flexible. It wasn't on glass plates anymore, and it wasn't the wet process. So it could be stored and put in a camera and used. He was an avid photographer and became the founder of the Eastman Kodak Company. The first Kodak contained a 20-foot roll of film capable of recording up to 100 photos. The customer would then mail the camera with the film in it back to Kodak and have the film processed. In 1901, 120 size film was introduced, and it's still in use today. Now, over the years, I told people when they started realizing that the era of the film camera was on its way out, that you never have to worry about 120 film. This is the box that professional 120, which was called 220, it actually has 24 exposures, 5 rolls like this in it. When we shot a wedding, we carried 3 or 4 of these boxes, and these are the cameras that shoot 120. But it goes all the way back to probably the early 1900s, where cameras used it. So I still probably say that 120 film will always be available, but the processing of it is going to be really difficult. 1901, as I said, is when it was introduced, and obviously that's when the first 120 camera came out. Color film was invented in 1935 by Eastman. It was Kodachrome, which means slide film. 1936, a year later, Kodak made 8mm film for home movies and 35mm film available. 1947, Edwin Land demonstrated the Polaroid camera and black and white for it. Incidentally, Dr. Land made a lot of money and made himself a name earlier when he invented polarizing filters. Polarizing filters are where you have a sheet of glass or a sheet of acetate that's scribed with parallel lines, and if you look out the window and you see a car, let's say out there, that has shine coming off the windshield, and you want to photograph somebody in that car, you take the polarizing filter for your camera and you turn it 90 degrees, and it just takes that shine away, and you can look right through shiny glass. Same thing happens on water. The sun hits the water and the rays come back to you in a flat plane. So this is where Polaroid sunglasses came from. They polarized it such that glare coming off of shiny surfaces, especially water and sand, would be gone. So it saved your eyes. Well, he made a lot of money and invented something that nobody else had worked on. He sold the government a lot of polarizing filters during the war. They used it for looking through things. But also, if you take 2 sheets of polarizing material, as you can see with my hands, I can look right through between my fingers. But if I turn one up 90 degrees, it blocks out all the light, so it becomes black. Well, that was an important factor. You could take something where there was too much light, and you could turn it part of the way and dim it down. and I'm pretty sure that's what happens in your digital camera today. There's a polarizing system in there that kind of adjusts the ASA of the camera. After he had made a pretty good name for himself with polarizing material, he had a little girl who had a birthday one day, and he took her picture, and she said, "Daddy, why can't I see the picture now?" And he couldn't answer that. He said, "Well, you just can't. We have to send it into the lab or process it in the basement." But he went to work on it. And Dr. Land was a driven man. They say there was nobody like him. Once he set his mind on something, he just worked at it until he solved the problem. He once worked for 18 days without changing his clothes. He would skip meals. He'd work right on through mealtime. They had to bring him food and make him eat. He had at least 2 shifts of people. When he was working intently on a project, he would work right on through, and after the one team got tired, he'd send them away and bring in the second team to keep on working with him. By 1947, November, he had come up with Polaroid film, black and white, and a camera to shoot it. And he made 60 cameras to be released for Christmas, 1947 or 1948. And he thought he had plenty of time to run another batch through. Okay, he made 60 cameras. He kept 2 of them back and put the other 47 out for sale in some big merchandiser like a Macy's or something. Within 1 hour, all the cameras were sold and the film. So he had to get to work. In 1963, Polaroid color film was invented. By 1983, the Polaroid company had 13,000 employees, 1.3 billion in sales, and over 1,000 patents. Now that sounds like a man who didn't get much sleep. 1990 to 1999, the digital camera sales made Polaroid the #1 digital camera seller in the U.S. Now that surprised me because I'd never heard much about digital cameras from Polaroid. 2001, Polaroid files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Isn't that odd? Like that. And in 2002, a new company bought the old Polaroid company, launching a new era for Polaroid. As a matter of fact, we bought a flat screen TV about 6 months ago, and it's a Polaroid. I never would have guessed it, but it was the least expensive and had the best color and so forth for our... Yes, Anna?
Was Mr. Land still living when he was there?
No, I don't think so. I think he had passed away. And we call him Dr. Land, but he had no degree and no training as a scientist from that standpoint. He went to Harvard for a year, then he quit, and he worked, and after he made a bunch of money with his polarizing filters, and I guess when he got his camera started, he decided to go back to Harvard and try to get a degree, but he was so driven by his newest idea that he wouldn't even do his homework. So his wife took his assignments and would say to him, What's the answer to this? He would tell her, she'd write it down, she'd hand the papers in. But he didn't graduate. So he got the honorary degree from people who knew him, but the Wall Street Journal would never give him that honor by calling him doctor. In 1925, Leica in Germany introduces the first 35mm film and their camera that used it. The Leica is still considered to be probably the collectible camera. My son has one, I don't. It's pretty expensive. 1933, world's first 35mm camera, the German Exacta. 1934, first 35mm film cartridge. This made it easy for the layman to load film. Before that, it was kind of tough to put film in a camera. 1948, the first Polaroid camera sold, as I mentioned that. 1962 to 68, the Hasselblad cameras were used in space and on the moon. 1973, first digital camera, 0.1 megapixel. Yesterday we photographed, my wife and I photographed a family reunion with 125 people in the picture, and I bumped the image size up for the first time since I bought the camera to 18 megapixels. I've been shooting it at 8 and perfectly happy. But I thought, better have a little extra pixels there. The first iPad tablet was released in 2010. As of January 2015, there have been over 250 million iPad tablet computers sold. Apple iPad tablet computers are second to Android-based ones in sales since 2013. 2012, the iPhone 5 was introduced, and 2013, the GoPro Hero camera was introduced, worn by hikers and bikers on their chest or helmet to record their trails and in drone photography, since they're durable, light, and high quality. Now, I think most of the better drone camera or planes will be carrying a GoPro. This is a picture I got in the mail yesterday or Friday from an auctioneer, and it just kind of stood out to me that this picture alone, we say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. This picture must be worth 10,000 words. Because if I were to show you what that property looks like and give you a pretty good idea, I would have had to shoot both sides of the house. I would have had to shoot the back, the deck, the yard, the fence around the yard. I mean, it could have taken up to 10 pictures to do that. Here, you look at it, you see everything. You see the yard, how it's all landscaped, everything in one picture. So this is truly the wave of the future. And then here's a picture of the front of the house, shows the road coming in, the parking area. And not only that, but this picture shows the condition of the roof. You always would wonder that if you were going to buy a house. So they're being used to look at architectural features such as what do your gutters look like, what your roof look like, and all that. Pretty fantastic picture. These are some popular cameras over the years. There's the Polaroid camera. This is it folded up. This is a Rolleiflex twin lens reflex. Now the twin lens, and there's 3 of them over there on the table, those are the cameras I used for up to 40 years. You look through the upper lens and then the picture's taken through the lower lens. And as I said earlier, there were a lot of accessories that were necessary for someone to use a camera to its fullest. We had different viewfinders. We had a viewfinder plate, a glass plate that went in there that would focus very fine, so you could use it to just look at the grain almost on something. Or you had a fast focusing one. It was a split image. It had a little lens built into the center of it, and if you looked at something, you could bring 2 lines together very quick for things like sports photography. Just a wonderful camera. But this camera, my Mamiya, and I have 3 models and lots of attachments, was my favorite. This has what's called a double extension bellows. Right about here is where you're usually using it to take pictures. But look at this, it keeps on going. With this camera, you can focus down to about here. Now when you're copying old photos or photographing money or coins or whatever, insects or whatever floats your boat, that was a really neat feature. And then it also had interchangeable lenses, so you had telephoto lenses, wide-angle lenses, normal lenses. It was quite a system. Very heavy, heaviest camera I've carried, I guess. Then, of course, we have the tablet, iPad, and that's the exact, I mentioned, Russian camera. Very good camera. And this is, how many people know what that is? It's called a brick.
Argus C3.
The Argus C3, the brick. It was very popular in 1948, 50. A lot of dads coming home from the war bought one of those and brought it home for their family, or they just bought it in the United States. A very popular camera. Argus was competing, of course, with some of the big boys, and they did an excellent job. It was a good camera. And then this is just a common Mamiya 35, very popular. Lots of those were sold. The early Canon and its lens line, part of its lens lineup. And over on the table you see the big tall telephoto. That's a Canon telephoto. Nikon, this is one I used. I had 2 or 3 of those when I did newspaper work. That was the one I used. When I'd shoot a wedding, I'd shoot the pictures to sell with the big camera, and then I'd use the Nikon with black and white film to shoot for the newspaper. This is the Hasselblad 500EL used on the moon in 1964. That's the next camera I want to invest money on. Even though it's that old, it's still one I want to have on that table the next time. It's basically a square cube. You plug in any number of lenses. This is the film canister on the back. It could shoot just a couple shots or one shot, or in this case, 200 shots, I think. This was the NASA camera that went to the moon. And down here is the motor drive and electronics. So that's probably one of the most famous cameras in history, and that's why I am making a big deal of it. When they were flying, first the flights over the moon where they didn't land, they were just kind of surveying. They were carrying Hasselblads. And if you had 3 or 4 astronauts in the capsule, they, maybe half of them were loaded with black and white film and half were loaded with color film. So you'll see a picture after a while of that famous Earthrise, they called it, where they were flying from behind the moon. All of a sudden one morning they looked out one of the windows and they saw the Earth rising, and the one fellow shot it with black and white, and he said, "Quick, pass me a camera with color film." And it's one of the most famous photographs ever taken. The cameras on the Apollo mission were standard 500DL cameras, but were modified to adapt to space. Each camera had a glass film within the camera body with crosshairs etched in it, and that made a grid, and then when NASA would inspect the photos taken by it, they could use the grid to determine the size of objects off in the distance. NASA's involvement also spurred Hasselblad to work with Carl Zeiss, a lens producer which nowadays is perhaps best known for designing the lenses of popular smartphone models by Nokia and Sony Ericsson. The lenses were calibrated to ensure high-quality, low-distortion images and came with a detachable polarizing filter. There's that polarizing filter I mentioned. And like many other technologies, such as freeze-dried food and cordless power tools, which were spurred on by the space race, these lenses eventually came to the domestic market. Finally, the cameras were also given a silver finish to make them more resistant to variations in temperature. When the sun shines on a black body in space, it gets very hot very quickly. There's the Earthrise. There's the black and white images. It just came over the edge of the moon, and there's with color image a little bit later. Oh, let's see. Okay. These cameras went up to the moon with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, each equipped with film cartridges which could capture up to 200 images. Naturally, as anyone who has flown long distance can attest, luggage space is always at a premium, so the astronauts left behind 12 cameras that accompanied them to the moon. But lucky for us and for future generations, they remembered to bring the film cassettes back. Now, I can't help but think that one of our grandchildren is going to someday fly up there and bring those 12 cameras back, and they'll end up in 12 important museums. The Minox was a spy camera. Let's see, I don't have a Minox either. That's one thing that other things come first. My son does, but I've got the next best thing. This is a little Minolta 16. They both use 16 millimeter film. And let's see, let's say who the guy is. A Baltic German, Walter Zapp, decided he wanted to build a sub-miniature camera in 1922, and he worked on it until 1936. He wanted it small enough he could carry it with him all the time. So he took a block of wood and he carved it to the size and shape of a Minox. They're about that long, about that high, and about that deep. A little longer and a little smaller than this one, something like that. After he got the size of the wood to his liking and rounded the corners off slightly, then he went about making the camera works for inside that case. They both work the same way. You want to take a picture, you slide it apart, you look through the viewfinder, and you click it. Then when you push it in, it advances the film. Now the original Minox has an 18-inch chain attached to it, and you could take that chain and pull it down and lay it on a document and shoot, and the document would be in focus. This camera was too expensive for most people, so it became the favorite of rich boys traveling over the world and several countries that they used it for spy work. America, Russia, and Germany became interested in it. Like I say, if they broke into somebody's office and they wanted to photograph a document, they just stretched the chain out and they could quickly shoot images. To put the film in here, you click a little thing, you pull this out, and the film is on two spools linked together with a little piece of plastic, and you just drop it in, so it's very quick to load. And adding many different models and digital cameras to their line has helped Minox survive to this day. There's a picture of the Minox, and there's the chain, and there's the film cassette. From the camera obscura to your smartphone, photos were once expensive and intended for only the wealthy. You now have in your pocket a camera, or you carry a tablet that can share your photos with your family and friends and send your photos around the world. Modern uses of photography include, for instance, the Gaston County postcard, a little advertising, and again, for photos brought together to give you an idea of what's going to happen. Drone photography. I have a feeling this one on this auction bill might have been taken by Tony Carosella at New Haven, a very famous drone photographer these days. And this one was definitely done by him of the church at Starkenburg. May and I make Christmas houses out of cardboard. Each year we release a new house. It might be a church, or it might be a courthouse, or something like that. This is possibly the next Christmas house we're going to do, and if not this year, in the next couple of years. And this is a great photo for me to see what the roof looks like, because that's pretty tricky sometimes when you're on the ground. Now, this is a photo that was brought to me just within the last week by Carl Morris. Carl's right here. And his great-grandpa built the store at Drake and several other towns. A common feature, he told me, is this little track that comes out of this window, and they could use it to haul furniture and heavy loads up and down. But the important thing here to see is that there's a tent set up out here, and it says on it, New York Photographic Studio, I think, and Dr. Tainter from Lynn in 1883 set that up. He was a dentist and a photographer. So while he was there, you could pull your teeth and take your picture. The original picture of this is pretty neat because it shows a lot of people on the porch. There's a boy holding a buggy wheel. There's a boy up on the roof. I'm not sure what he's doing. I guess he just wanted a better view. And it's just a neat, timely photo that I could show you today. This is the Walther store in Gasconade, Missouri. That was a family that had a general store when the boat yards was in Gasconade, and it was a going town. These old photos show the gas types that they were pumping, and sometimes ice cream signs. And you know, you've seen them. This is a postcard from Bay, Missouri, and it was taken from a cemetery. You all probably know where that's at. And this is the Heckman Mill on the Gasconade River. It's got the sign Heckman Mill here, but you have to almost be in a dark room to see it. Now there's a steamboat, notice, and I'm kind of thinking that might be as far as the steamboats could go up the Gasconade. I may be wrong. Maybe there was a bypass that they could take. But I want to see if anybody knows what this ramp is about over here on the right hand. Anybody know? It was used for ice harvesting. Years ago I gave a talk on ice harvesting, and I didn't know at the time what that was, but I found out since. In the winter they would have an elevator like, and they could hoist it up, and it might have been run with a steam engine or whatever, maybe horsepower. Oh, this is a favorite. Helen Wesselschmidt gave me permission to copy this years ago. This is, let's see, Anna Waldecker's bridal shower in 1925. Some of you know Waldecker's. Now this is obviously the bride. This is Anna. And if we didn't have so much light, you'd see a lot more detail, but she's got a whole bunch of clothespins clipped on her collar. There's people in front here that have pots and pans and coffee pots. There's a box of cocoa down here, bars of soap. She's holding a little broom in her hand. This is really outfitting a young lady for her jobs around the house. It's so neat. And you've got everybody from an older generation down to little girls down here. So that picture tells me so much. It's got so many stories. Of course, there's the laundry basket, and there's all kinds of laundry piled on, like pillowcases and so forth. This is a pretty neat picture I got a few years ago. There's a horse and buggy, a team and buggy, and the family's all sitting out here all dressed up. So this might have been the old folks' home, and the young couple came in the horse and buggy, and they all posed for their family picture. But this kind of a picture shows me a lot more besides the horse and buggy. Over here there's a grape vineyard or grape arbor, and there's a cistern, and just a lot of little details. This is a postcard that was made at Herman. That's the Herman depot. And it said there were Highland Farms hatchery was shipping 6,200 baby chicks in one single shipment. On the back of the Model A here, if that's what it is, it says Highland Hatchery. And all those boxes are filled with baby chicks. Now think about hatching out 6,000 baby chicks and keeping them all alive before you ship them. And this is Edward and Connie Riediger in their store in 1910 in Herman. Now we've copied a number of old store photos. This is, of course, the counter where you lay out fabrics and cut them to size and whatever else you need to do. But this caught my eye. There's a whole pile of suitcases here, luggage. This kind of indicates Herman being a traveling community. I have taken so many passports in Herman. I always say that I don't think any town around has as many travelers as Herman does. So that must have been a really big part of their inventory. And of course you've got brooms and all the other things that a general store would have. This is a Laclede steel photograph. A locomotive just come in, and the man I got this from had worked for Laclede Steel. And he told me when a locomotive came in, before it even cooled off, they started cutting it up. And the first thing off of it was the bell. Cutting the bell off was like cutting the heart out of the beast. And then they start cutting off the parts around the edges that are cooler, and eventually they get it down to wheels and just a pile of steel. There's a whole series of these that are really interesting. This is a colorized version of the Hindenburg. I don't think there were any color photos at that time. But this points out an important thought I have on photography. We all know these classic pictures of the Hindenburg. How would we know other than having a picture of it? Somebody was in the right place at the right time and photographed that. So it's almost like all of us have been there. We know the picture. This is a postcard I just came across recently. It's a steel inside the Missouri State Capitol building. And you don't really think about it when you see all that stone of the skeleton that has to be inside to hold that all up. And I can't help but wondering if this is the inside of the statue of Ceres standing on it, who represents, I believe, the goddess of harvest. It may be that there's another little tower under her and she's on top of it. I haven't looked at a recent photo. And this is a neat picture from Hope, postcard. How we do things at Hope, Missouri. They got a big sled under this pickle, and he's got 2 mules attached to it. And there was a lot of that kind of photography. We've got pictures of wagons with one ear of corn on, and all kinds of things. I think that's fun. Okay, now some answers. What did the first camera look like? The room with a pinhole. What year was the first real photo taken? 1826. But, as I said, there were a lot of people working toward making a photograph, so they wouldn't have to sit there and draw on the wall. So even though that's the first photo that has lasted, it wasn't commercially feasible yet. 1839 is when Decour turned his rights over to the French government. So we consider 1839 to be the official birth of photography. In what country was the photographic process developed? In France. When were the first photos taken in America? About 1851. During what war were over 7,000 photos made? Civil War. Who was George Eastman? The founder of Eastman Kodak. Who was Dr. Edwin Land? What year was the first digital camera introduced? 1973. What modern devices have almost made the family camera obsolete? Cell phones and tablet computers. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes. Hardly anybody takes the camera out. By the way, I'm going to add a little something here. I just found out a couple weeks ago that you can take a roll of film to Walmart and they will send it in and have it processed for you. They don't do it themselves anymore, they send it out. But it's good to know. Sometimes you come across a few rolls, or this happens especially, people would take a few pictures in a roll, and they'd put the camera away and forget about it, and all of a sudden you come by and think, you know, the last time I used this camera was at my so-and-so's wedding. We ought to send those in. Now you can do that. You can finish out the roll and take it in and have it processed. Remember, a camera is a tool. It's an extension of our eyes and brain. A few words about storage. We tend to store many of our digital images today in digital media, sometimes in a slideshow where we only see it for seconds. Tangible, old-fashioned, printed photographs held in frames not only continue to appear for years upon years, as opposed to mere seconds, they also feed the human soul. Prints hung on walls or placed on countertops or your desk define our space. That makes your space yours only. And do so in a far less temporary way than do digital displays. So do copy your images now and then to a secure media, such as a DVD, flash drive, or a extra hard drive that you don't access very often. If you don't, you may lose all your photos if you have a camera or computer malfunction. Enjoy your photography. Ever so often, think about all the inventions that make photography so easy for us today. I also want to add that what I've covered today is pretty much the mechanics of photography, the cameras and the years and the chemicals and so forth, but it goes a lot beyond that. I pointed out a few times, like the picture of the Hindenburg. Having a photograph gives you a link to the past, and oftentimes one day in time only. It'll never happen again. And you may have grandparents who passed away before you were around, and you don't have any other way of knowing what they look like. But with a photograph, you can look at them and say, oh, gee, you know, yeah, he had a hair till he was 90 years old. What happened to me? Or whatever it is. It gives you that little bit of history that sometimes we need to know. And just helps you remember. I'm sure you all have photo albums at home, and you look at them occasionally, and you remember the good times you had at weddings and other family events. So there's a lot more to photography that I haven't talked much about, but it's one of the most important things in life, I think. Now, I've got some cameras up here. I'm going to run through it quickly. Yeah, that'd be fine. This is the camera obscura. This is one I made using a portrait lens, and it captures light, comes in here, and there's a mirror in here, and reflects the image onto a piece of tissue paper. Earlier, I had Mr. Cruz, your president, sit for me, and in about 45 seconds, I traced his image on here. I'll take that and sandwich it with a piece of black paper, maybe a piece of white if I can find it, cut around it with scissors, and I'll have a silhouette portrait, and we can put that in an oval mat, and I'll give this to the museum, and you can put it in a showcase or something, and you'll have a permanent record of that. This is a favorite of mine because it was the first camera, one like it, the first camera I worked with at about 12 years old. My dad had one like this. It's called an autographic. It had a little stylus in the back of the camera. It's almost always lost nowadays, so I'm going to have to go on eBay and buy 2 or 3 of them because I've got at least 2 of these, and they're about $15. It's just a stick of metal that's kind of neat. And you could open this up after you took a picture, and you could scratch with that stylus the information that you wanted to be with it. Maybe Niagara Falls, Wednesday, something like that. When you got your pictures back, it would be on the picture down at the bottom. This camera is in such good condition, I'm pretty sure it was never sold and never used. If you wanted to do a self-portrait with it or photograph a group, it had this little thing here you could flip out. It has a hole in it. You could run a string through here, up to here, and you'd pull the string and it would take the picture. We also had this that would trip the shutter and it wouldn't shake the camera. You can turn this sideways and you can turn the camera this way. It has this foot that can come down and keep it level. And it folds up into a very small space. Now, something I need to point out is that a lot of these cameras, when they show up on auctions, get ruined by somebody at the auction or the person who buys it. They don't know how to get them open. This one has a little button that you can see to open it, but a lot of them don't. And people look around, they don't know how to get it open. They flip this up, and they pull, and they stick a screwdriver in here and pry on it, and they damage it. There's a hidden button on these kind of cameras under the leather, right there, right here. This one has the leather worn out above the button, but you can see the button hiding under there. When you press that, the front drops open, and then you can pull your camera out. This happens to be a stereo camera. That's why it's got 2 lenses. And these lenses are the distance apart of your eyes. So you take a picture with this, it puts 2 images on your film. Then, when you advance the film, it puts 1 image between them and over here. And it keeps on going like that. Then you have to use a stereopticon to look at the picture made by that. This is a real favorite of mine. It has a red bellows. A camera with a red bellows is always kind of special to me. This is the viewer. And you look in there. It's just made to take horizontal pictures. This is an air cylinder, so you could put a hose on there with a squeeze bulb and take pictures. It has a little plastic disc, not plastic, but celluloid. It says Erker Brothers Optical Company, 608 Olive Street, St. Louis, Missouri. So it was sold by them. This one is an early camera that used plate holders. This would go in there, carrying 2 sheets of film, and when you wanted to focus it, you would open the trap door, there's a ground glass, you'd open up the shutter on time, and you'd focus the camera, and then you'd close that up, and you'd slip that film holder in, and you load these in the dark, and when it was in the camera, you pull the dark slide out. There's a sheet of film. You take your picture, then you turn this over and put it back in, and you flip a little retainer around so you couldn't pull it out accidentally. Then you turn it over. Now in this case, both sides are black. That means both sides have been exposed. This is a very important camera that was used by sports photographers, people like paparazzi, anybody that needed to work in the newspaper industry, magazine industry, needed to work fast. They came out. This is a 2 1/4, 3 1/4. It takes a sheet of film this size. This goes in the back, and you expose the film like I just pointed out, pull the slide out. This camera has a sports finder, You could put this eyepiece up and you could look through it and you could follow action on the court. Or you could use this. This all collapses down. It has what's called a rising front. You can loosen these and the front of the lens comes up and down. That would be so you can take a picture of a church, let's say, and normally when you tip a camera, the church, all the walls go to a point. With that rising front, that doesn't happen. You can also slide it sideways, and I was pointing out earlier, with being able to slide the lens sideways, if you're taking a picture over there, and there's a tree right here, and you want to shoot it straight on, and you can't shoot through the tree, you can move the camera beside the tree and slide the front over, and it looks like you've taken it from right in front of it. Lots of other little features. This is an early movie camera made by Kodak. You wind it up. This is a pretty laid back. It's made by Nikon, the people who made that Nikon camera. And it would go into one of these cameras with the slide-in film. And it would take either 35 full frame, or you turn this little thing, and 2 trapdoors would come in and give you half frame. And when you did that, it also reset the counter, so instead of taking, let's say, 24 exposures on a roll of film, it would do 48, it would double it. So if you needed to save film, you could do that. This would have been a pretty expensive and pretty desirable piece for somebody probably in the 70s and 80s. These are just a bunch of little pocket cameras, they call them, because they fold up, don't take up hardly any space. I've got a lot of those. This is a big box camera, real early. This is a late box camera, 1930s probably. They took fairly good pictures. It was a very simple lens. You had a slide-up device that would let you do different apertures on a bright day or on a dim day, change that. And you could do an instantaneous picture, or you could do a time exposure with it. This is another device that was pretty neat. This went into the back of one of these cameras with the film holder back, and this made it into a Polaroid camera. You could put a Polapack in there and make it. This was used in some of the better, like these. Let's say you were shooting products in your studio, and you want to make sure that you're getting it right before you put the film in and send it off to the lab. And at that time, it might have taken 1 day to a week to get your thing back. You could shoot a Polaroid and look at it and say, oh my gosh, I got one of my lights and this ain't. I have to change that. Now this is very much like that first Polaroid camera I showed you. This is a little later version, but this is one heck of a piece of machinery. You press this, it pops open. Slide this out. Look at this built-in lens cap, isn't that neat? And it's got a lot of adjustments on the lens. You could shoot flash with it, but as you know by now, the Polaroid process involved a pretty complicated packet, especially at this time. So after you shot the picture, you flip this, and then you pull the tab, and out came your picture. You lay it down for a minute and process it. Now, this is what's behind the scenes. Open this up, and pull this out. Let's see, pull this out. Isn't that something? You put your pack of film in here, and you put a roll that had chemistry, I believe it was, in here. Close it up. Close this up and latch it. And then after you shot the picture and you pulled it out, the rollers squeezed the chemical across the picture and made it process. So just think about a man inventing this from nothing. And this is the focusing wheel. When you turn that, that bellows went in and out. I pointed out that this is the Argus C3 called Brick. It was shaped like a brick. And there's an awful lot of those around the country. In my years as an antique dealer, I've had at least a dozen of those, and I've still got 4 to 6 of them. This is an electronic flash. It took the place of these bulbs. Any old newspaper photographer or somebody working for a magazine or working for a school yearbook would have used these. One shot, and then you throw it away. The electronic flash, you put some batteries in there, and it'll shoot all day. And when you run out of batteries, you just put 4 more in, and away you go. A lot of attachments, like this one, can go on a simple tripod, and you can tilt your camera. 35mm cassettes, from some of the latest to one of the earlier ones made out of aluminum. A light meter was one of the accessories you needed to take a reading of the light that was on the scene. Minolta made a lot of little cheap cameras for family use. We probably went through two or three of those. This is Yashica. That was a Japanese company. We had 2 or 3 of those. The Yashica LM. This might be the one that had a special back. You could actually shoot 35mm or 120 with it. That was kind of a neat feature. And then I pointed out the Mamiya Ready. This is a super cheap plastic camera for film. These were probably given away a lot of times by realtors and anybody that wanted to get your attention. Here's a Batman camera, film. Crayola kids camera. Now this used the, I don't know what they call this yet, little drop-in cassette. Yeah, 110 film. Then, basically, the rest of these are Polaroids. As I said, Polaroid made a lot of products and a lot of money, and they must have brought out a new camera every week. This was one that was kind of neat. Pop-up flash, a sonar, rangefinder, so when you aimed that, it focused itself. This is what the Polaroid color film looked like. This is kind of an unusual one. This was a professional camera that we used for making passports. You cocked it, you had a long shutter release, you click it, and it would make 2 pictures on the same sheet of Polaroid film. So if somebody was traveling, they'd come in and get instant Polaroid. Now, a few years ago, they switched to color only, and I wasn't doing color with this very well, so we had to switch to another means. Of course, you all know about the tablet and all the things it can do. And a Canon that I just got recently, just a fantastic camera. It will do, I think, 11 shots per second in burst mode. That means if you want to help somebody study his golf swing or his batting stance, you can say, go, and he starts his swing, and in that time you might take 15 pictures. It's just amazing. And there's lots of other uses. You can take rotating machinery and take pictures of it and freeze it. Does anybody have any questions? Anna?
How long did they use glass plates? There was something in our family area, there was these pretty large glass negatives. They were actually pretty good though. You could do a contact, it was very sharp.
Yeah, that's the good news about the glass plates. You can contact them and make multiple images. Let me shut this down. I did not look at that, but the daguerreotypes, like I said, were on copper, and that was a one-shot deal. You couldn't make copies. Once you got to the point where you could make copies, that made it a lot less expensive because you could make duplicates. I'd have to look that up.
I think Ed Kemper's photos were the era 1890 to 1910, and those were, he used glass plate negatives.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Anna
I don't know if
gives
that
Yeah, those are all glass plates. Yes?
Is the term daguerreotype and tintype interchangeable? Or they're exactly the same thing?
Pretty much, yeah. There was calotype and different ones where they actually used paper, and sometimes they'd actually put the paper against another piece of paper and print through it, but that wasn't a very good photograph because you got the texture of the paper along through.
Do you think film will completely disappear, or will there be, I always thought it might hang around because we have a very simple camera with film. You go click, you don't have to do anything, but as you said, the processing now is going to be a problem.
I think some sizes will hang around for a long time, like 120. 35, I would think so. Certainly not 110 and probably not 127, but 35 and 120 I think would be around. Because let's face it, there's so much equipment out there that can use them as long as somebody's willing to pay. Now our son I mentioned before lives in Chicago, and he buys vintage cameras, cleans them up, tunes them up, and goes out and shoots almost all film. And of course in Chicago he's got his choice of processors and everything else, but it's getting to where processing a roll costs about as much as the Polaroid process did, which was always a little higher than anything else.
The Brownie camera that my mother was that took thousands of shots with, what can you say about that? I mean, the film was bigger, wasn't it?
Yeah, the good news about the brownies, and actually the term brownie goes way back, I guess to at least 1910, and goes up probably into the 30s or 40s. I think that some of these are called brownies, but at any rate, it was a camera made for families, it was easy to use, and the big negative was really a plus because you didn't have the very best lenses like you do on the later cameras like the Mamiya, so the big negative made up for that. And even if you shook it a little bit or it wasn't as bright outside as it should have been, the big negative just covered a lot of problems. You take the professionals who were shooting 8 by 10, 6.5 by 8, even 5 by 7, they had a terrific negative to work with, so you got really sharp pictures. But you also have to remember that in the era of portrait photography, where they were using the big negatives, they did a lot of retouching with a pencil, and you can't retouch 35mm film. You take a big film, and if they've got a scar or they've got wrinkles, you can go in and you can take that off and make a nice looking portrait. Yes?
My first camera was a Brownie Bullseye, 1956.
All the way up to 56. Huh?
Yeah. Well, it could have been lying in that small town drugstore for 10 years before I bought it. I don't know. You know what I mean?
I think, if I remember right, I saw somewhere that Kodak kind of patented the Brownie as a trademark, and they had
And then reproduced it.
nobody else could use it, and they used it for a long time.
On the negatives that you had from all those, what do you do though? Just throw them in the trash? What should you do with the negatives? If you've got a bunch of negatives from years past, what do you do with
That's a
them?
good question. I know, we've got 4, 8, 12. We've got 4 file cabinets. Each one has
Yeah.
16 drawers full of negatives and proofs and the paperwork that went with
And
it.
what about all the
And we don't
slides?
know what to do
What
with
about
it.
all the slides, the duplicate slides?
Because you can't hardly have a professional negative printed anymore. So if somebody comes and says, you photographed our wedding 40 years ago, it's really hard. If there's 1 or 2 images they want, I'll copy the negative myself. But to send it out is cost prohibitive.
What about the slides?
Slides are good, and there's a lot of slide duplicators around. You can get one for your computer, or you can send them out to different
Or you
photo
can make a
houses.
print on them?
They'll scan them and make a CD or make prints, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Yeah.
What's your opinion? Is digital a better image or a good high quality film?
Well, that's kind of a trick question. From ease of use, digital is the way to go, of course. It's just so neat. As somebody who used film for a long time, I'd say I like film a lot, but I just can't compete with it. I think we got our first digital camera in 1985. That was like 10 years, 11, 12 years after the digital first one was introduced. And it made very small pictures, not much better than that 0.1 megapixel. But they've improved. Like my brother-in-law said years ago, I asked him about digital music, and he said, well, to someone who likes music, digital music is shallow.
Yeah.
It does not have the depth that good old-fashioned analog music has. And I noticed that more and more as I play my music. So digital has its drawbacks. One thing it does is it can blow out the detail and highlights very easy. You've got to really guard against that. And when that happens, you don't have much recourse. So therefore, I like to shoot a little bit dark if that's a problem. And you can always work with it then. So in other words, if you don't have information there, you can't do anything with it.
Yeah, nice review of the history of this. Enjoyed it. You covered space and ground and air, and I didn't get back to Columbia this week, but I was going to bring my little Kodak Instamatic spring crank power advancer in my light underwater housing, which was a very easy, simple way for a 16-year-old kid to get into underwater photography. It was a lot of fun, but they even made things like that, so you could do a little underwater work. I know my sister and her friends loved when I took their pictures underwater at the Herman Pool. But, underwater, of course, cameras that were moving cameras also have one of those. But, so it's just a little different view of what cameras can do, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Specialized cameras are certainly something we could have talked a long time about. Underwater, another one I didn't mention was they sent cameras up to Mars, I think, and they photographed, in one photo I saw it was the foot of the lander, and then around it were the rocks and gravel. Well, you can immediately see what that ground looks like, but think how long it'll take for us to go up there and look at it with our eyes. So, and the same thing with the drone photography.
And I think the reason they may have left the cameras on the moon was because they wanted to make sure they had enough moon rocks.
That's it, exactly. I didn't mention that.
Blast off.
Yeah.
I mean, fuel weighs, cameras weigh, suits weigh. They actually threw some of their suits on the moon.
Yeah.
Some special hats that they had.
I think I saw 48 pounds of rocks they brought back.
200 pounds.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Okay.